They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it is edited by the terrified. In the earliest colonial records of America, there are gaps so deliberate they feel like scars. Pages where ink should be, names scratched out so violently the paper nearly tears. One of those missing names, whispered only in fragments and folklore, was Jabari Mansa. Not a king in chains, not a saint, not a rebel in the way history prefers, but something far more dangerous. A man who remembered who he was. Before the ships came, Jabari was born under a sun that did not fear him. He belonged to a lineage that measured power not by land, but by memory. Elders said his bloodline carried the weight of stories older than conquest, older than maps. When betrayal opened the gates of his homeland, he did not beg. Witnesses later claimed he stood silent as iron bit his wrists, his eyes fixed not on his captors, but on the ground, as if memorizing it for later. The ocean should have erased him. Instead, it learned his name. Those who survived the crossing spoke of nights when the waves fell unnaturally still. Men leapt into the water screaming about voices beneath the hull. The ship's log mentioned sickness, then madness, then sudden deaths with no visible cause. By the time land appeared, the crew had stopped writing entirely. In America, Jabari was sold, renamed, and buried beneath forced labor like so many others. But something refused to stay buried. At night, enslaved people claimed he spoke in a language that made the air feel heavy. He warned them of things before they happened. He carved symbols that caused overseers to avoid certain paths without knowing why. Owners called him dangerous, not because he disobeyed, but because he watched, listened, and remembered. That is when the records begin to vanish. Church logs omit him. Plantation ledgers contradict each other. Letters reference a problem that was handled, yet offer no details. And then, one year, Jabari Mansa simply ceases to exist on paper. No death. No sale. No escape notice. Just silence. But silence, like memory, has a way of surviving. Even now, in the backwoods where plantations once rotted into the soil, people avoid certain trees. They say the ground there feels wrong. As if history itself is holding its breath, waiting for someone to say the name America tried so hard to forget. Jabari Mansa was not born into obscurity or weakness, but into a lineage that understood power long before foreign ships ever touched the African coast. His homeland in West Africa was governed by memory, oral law, and ancestral authority, where history was carried in bloodlines rather than books. Jabari was raised among elders who taught that identity was sacred and forgetting was the greatest form of death. From an early age, he was trained not only in leadership but in remembrance, taught the names of ancestors, old alliances, and forbidden knowledge meant to be spoken only in trusted circles. This heritage made him visible in ways he could not yet understand. When betrayal came, it did not arrive as an invading army but as trusted hands opening gates from within. Rival factions, tempted by foreign trade and promises of power, sold out their own people, marking certain families as valuable targets. Jabari's household was among the first taken, not because they were weak, but because they were feared. The night his kingdom burned, witnesses later recalled that Jabari did not scream or fight wildly. He stood still as fire consumed everything he knew, absorbing the destruction as if committing it to memory. His captors sensed this was no ordinary prisoner. They bound him quickly, avoided his eyes, and argued over whether he should even be kept alive. In that moment, Jabari's noble identity was not erased but violently severed, transformed into a dangerous liability that others believed could be broken through chains, distance, and the ocean itself, unaware that what they had truly captured was not just a man, but a living archive of a world they were trying to destroy. Jabari Mansa was taken alive with a level of caution rarely shown to captured men, and that hesitation revealed more than any chain ever could. His captors did not treat him as simple cargo meant only for profit, but as something unpredictable, something that carried weight beyond his physical body. Even after being bound, he was watched closely, his movements measured, his silence unsettling those who expected pleading or rage. Word had already spread among the raiders that Jabari was not an ordinary prisoner, that he came from a lineage people feared even in defeat. Some claimed he carried knowledge that could not be beaten out of a man, while others believed killing him outright might invite consequences they did not fully understand. This uncertainty kept him alive. During the march toward the coast, other captives were beaten for slowing down, yet Jabari was spared unnecessary violence, not out of mercy but caution. He met the eyes of his captors without hatred or submission, and that calm unsettled them more than resistance ever could. At night, guards whispered about whether he should be silenced before reaching the ships, arguing over rumors of curses, ancestral retribution, and spirits bound to bloodlines. Each step toward the ocean deepened their fear, yet none dared to end his life. By the time he reached the holding forts, Jabari was no longer seen as just a man but as a risk, a presence that could destabilize others simply by existing. His survival was not an act of kindness but a decision rooted in fear, greed, and superstition, setting the stage for a journey meant to strip him of power, unaware that what made him dangerous could not be confined by iron or distance. The Middle Passage was meant to erase Jabari Mansa completely, to break his body and scatter his memory into the ocean, yet something about the voyage turned against those who believed the sea would finish their work. From the moment the ship left the coast, unease spread among the crew, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The air below deck grew oppressive, thicker than heat alone could explain, and men accustomed to suffering began waking from sleep in terror, claiming they heard voices moving through the hull. Captives fell ill without warning, while others stared into nothingness, whispering names of places they had never seen. The ship's records noted sudden deaths that left no marks, men collapsing mid-task as if struck by an invisible force. Jabari remained alive through it all, silent, observing, his eyes reflecting neither fear nor despair. Crew members avoided standing too close to him, claiming the lamps flickered when he passed and the waves grew unnaturally calm at night. Storms that should have battered the vessel instead dissolved into eerie stillness, the ocean flattening as though listening. Superstition took hold quickly, and whispers spread that the ship was cursed, that something brought aboard had angered the sea itself. Fights broke out among sailors, blame shifting from sickness to divine punishment, then to Jabari. Some demanded he be thrown overboard, others argued that killing him would make things worse. The captain ordered silence in the logs, recording only vague references to loss and illness, desperate to keep the voyage moving forward. By the time land finally appeared, the ship carried fewer men than it had departed with, and those who survived would later refuse to speak of the crossing, convinced that something ancient had traveled with them and survived the ocean untouched. When Jabari Mansa arrived in colonial America, the first violence committed against him was not physical but historical. His name, which carried lineage and meaning, was immediately altered, shortened, and misspelled in official records, fractured into versions that no longer pointed back to a single identity. Traders and clerks treated this as routine, yet in Jabari's case the inconsistencies were unusually deliberate, as though uncertainty itself was being weaponized. Plantation ledgers listed him under different names within the same year, while shipping documents recorded conflicting origins, blurring his past beyond recognition. This confusion was not accidental. Colonial systems relied on order, but they also understood the danger of a man who remembered too much. By fragmenting Jabari's identity on paper, they weakened his ability to be traced, claimed, or believed. On the plantation where he was finally sold, even the overseers argued over what to call him, settling on whatever name suited the moment. Jabari did not correct them. He understood that erasure was a quieter form of control, one that operated through ink rather than whips. Church baptism records offered no clarity, listing him without a birthplace or lineage, reducing him to labor and obedience alone. Over time, the contradictions deepened, making it impossible for later officials to follow his trail with certainty. What should have been a simple entry became a puzzle of crossed-out lines and rewritten margins. In attempting to strip Jabari of his past, colonial record keepers unknowingly exposed their fear, revealing that his true threat was not rebellion, but memory, and the possibility that a man who knew who he was could not be fully owned, no matter how thoroughly history tried to lose him. On the remote plantation where Jabari Mansa was forced to labor, his presence began to unsettle those around him in ways that could not be easily explained. He spoke little, yet when he did, his words carried an unsettling certainty that drew others close despite their fear. Enslaved men and women whispered that Jabari seemed to know things before they happened, predicting punishments, deaths, and sudden changes in routine with an accuracy that felt impossible. He remembered names of ancestors spoken only in private, recalled villages he had never been told about, and described dreams that mirrored the nightmares of others. At night, when exhaustion should have silenced everyone, his voice carried softly through the quarters, telling stories that felt less like tales and more like recovered memories. Some claimed he spoke to the dead, not through rituals or displays, but through listening, as if the past itself leaned toward him. This reputation spread quietly, passed from mouth to mouth, because speaking too loudly invited danger. Overseers noticed changes as well, finding workers gathered near Jabari without explanation, their fear replaced by a calm that felt threatening in its own way. He never told anyone to resist, never called for violence, yet his presence alone seemed to restore something plantation life was designed to crush. The enslaved began to believe that Jabari carried a connection to a world beyond chains, a reminder that their suffering had meaning and memory. That belief frightened the owners more than defiance ever could, because it suggested that even in bondage, something essential remained untouched, something that could not be whipped away or buried, something that listened, remembered, and waited. The first signs that something was truly wrong appeared in places meant to be ordinary and unnoticed. Slave owners and overseers began finding strange symbols etched into fence posts, barn beams, and the packed earth near the quarters, marks that did not resemble Christian crosses, tribal brands, or anything recorded in their books. They were simple yet deliberate, formed with careful repetition, as if each line held meaning beyond decoration. When questioned, no one claimed responsibility, yet the markings continued to appear, always near paths where accidents later occurred or in areas animals refused to enter. The symbols unnerved the owners not because they were threatening, but because they felt intentional, placed by someone who understood the land itself. Jabari Mansa was never seen carving them, but suspicion followed him regardless. Workers whispered that the symbols were not spells or curses, but reminders, fragments of knowledge meant to anchor memory to the soil. Overseers attempted to erase them, scraping wood raw and turning the earth, only to find similar markings reappear days later. Horses grew restless near them, dogs refused to cross them, and men tasked with guarding those areas reported sudden illness or overwhelming dread. Plantation records mention these incidents only indirectly, dismissing them as superstition, yet private letters reveal growing fear. The owners worried that the markings represented a system of communication they could not decode, a language of resistance older than chains. What unsettled them most was the possibility that these symbols were not meant to cause harm at all, but to endure, outlasting both punishment and time, silently claiming the land in ways ownership papers never could. Tensions on the plantation reached a breaking point when an incident forced Jabari Mansa into public punishment, a display meant to break both his body and the fear he inspired. He had been accused of interfering with tools, of slowing work, though witnesses later insisted he had done nothing beyond speaking quietly to others or marking the ground with his cryptic symbols. The overseers, desperate to assert control, dragged him before the gathered laborers and struck him repeatedly, expecting cries, submission, and humiliation. Jabari's silence during the punishment unnerved them more than resistance ever could. As blows fell, whispers spread among the workers that the air itself had changed. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the sunlight, and animals fled the scene without explanation. By the end of the ordeal, several overseers had vanished, disappearing from their posts without record, leaving behind only scattered belongings and terrified witnesses who could not and would not speak openly about what had occurred. Panic spread among the ruling class, who struggled to rationalize these events, claiming accidents, missteps, or desertion, but privately fearing something far older and sharper had taken notice. Among the enslaved, Jabari's reputation deepened. He was not a man to fear in the conventional sense, but a conduit for knowledge and power that defied ownership. The public punishment, meant to destroy him, instead intensified the mystery surrounding him. It became clear that his presence alone could influence events in ways that could not be controlled, that defied logic, and that threatened the fragile sense of authority the plantation's hierarchy depended upon, leaving everyone, oppressor and oppressed alike, aware that they were witnessing forces beyond comprehension, forces tied to the man they could not break. As fear and curiosity spread among the enslaved, a secret began to form under the cover of darkness, gathering around Jabari Mansa in ways that frightened the overseers more than any act of open defiance could. At night, when lanterns burned low and the plantation lay in uneasy silence, small groups would meet in hidden corners, beneath trees whose roots clawed into the earth like ancient hands, or in abandoned outbuildings where no white eye could see. There, Jabari shared fragments of memory, history, and knowledge that had no place in the world above ground. He spoke of ancestors, of kingdoms erased by fire and betrayal, of a past so vivid that those who listened felt it pulse through their own veins. He guided them in marking the ground, teaching signs and symbols that carried meaning beyond words, a language of resistance encoded in earth and wood. These gatherings were quiet, deliberate, and careful. One misstep could mean death. Yet the enslaved came, drawn by something beyond hope or fear, a recognition that history, memory, and spirit could survive in secret. Through Jabari, they began to reclaim fragments of themselves, learning that obedience was not the only way to survive and that the past could be preserved even in chains. Rumors of these gatherings eventually spread to those above, who could feel a shift in the plantation's rhythm but could not locate its source. Whispers of ritual, of strange meetings, and of knowledge no outsider should possess made the overseers uneasy, planting a fear that Jabari was more than flesh and labor, that he was a living memory too powerful to be controlled, a force that connected the enslaved to a past they could never forget and a future they might yet claim. As the plantation's quiet defiance grew, colonial authorities began to take notice, though their response was careful, deliberate, and marked by fear. Reports of strange gatherings, unexplained accidents, and symbols carved into the earth reached local officials, who understood that what they faced was not mere disobedience but something that threatened the very control they relied upon. Rather than confronting it openly, they opted for secrecy, sending investigators who were instructed to leave no trace of their findings. Witnesses were questioned in hushed tones, their recollections altered by intimidation or bribery, and letters detailing the events were destroyed or redacted before reaching higher offices. Plantation records were rewritten to obscure any evidence of Jabari Mansa, replacing his name with generic entries or omitting him entirely, as if erasing him from paper could erase his presence in reality. Overseers who had survived the mysterious disappearances were summoned under the guise of routine inspections and cautioned against speaking freely, while servants who might remember too much were relocated, threatened, or bought off. The fear was not only that the enslaved might organize or resist, but that the memory of Jabari's influence could persist beyond their immediate control, spreading like an invisible contagion of knowledge and defiance. Even among the investigators, whispers circulated that something unnatural accompanied him, that the man who had survived chains, fire, and the ocean carried a force beyond their understanding. By the time the authorities withdrew, the plantation appeared orderly on the surface, yet beneath it, the marks of memory remained, hidden, defiant, and alive, and the effort to erase Jabari Mansa became a quiet obsession, one that would haunt the margins of history for generations to come. Then, as suddenly as he had arrived in colonial records, Jabari Mansa vanished, leaving behind no trace of his existence beyond whispers, marks on the earth, and a memory that refused to die. No death was recorded, no escape documented, no sale to another plantation noted. It was as if he had been pulled from the world itself, leaving the overseers and colonial authorities to fill the gaps with rumors and speculation. Those who had worked alongside him claimed to feel his presence long after he was gone, a shadow in the quarters, a murmur in the wind, a weight in the soil where he once marked the ground with symbols. Stories began circulating quietly among the enslaved, tales of a man who had walked into the night and dissolved into the land, leaving a legacy of resistance and knowledge that could not be erased by chains or ink. Plantation records, intentionally or not, offered only contradictions, leaving historians generations later to struggle with fragments, partial accounts, and hints of an existence that defied documentation. Scholars puzzled over letters and ledgers that referred vaguely to the problem or the one who cannot be controlled, while local legends preserved details that official histories had deliberately erased. Even today, in the forests and fields where the plantation once stood, elders warn of certain trees, certain clearings where the ground feels wrong, as if memory itself has settled there, holding on to a story no one dared fully write down. Jabari Mansa's disappearance became both a literal and symbolic void, a space where erasure failed, where history's attempts to suppress a life that remembered everything only amplified the force of the memory he carried.